The morning Glasha Ironblood walked onto Luke Bailey's land, she had every intention of walking straight back off it. She had not chosen to be here. She had not chosen any of what had led her to this frost-bitten edge of the Clearwater Valley, to this wind-scoured stretch of frontier where the mountains bit the sky in jagged teeth and the earth smelled of pine resin and hard work. She had not chosen the road that had unraveled beneath her boots across 3 weeks of travel, nor the bruises that purpled her ribs, where the men of the Coldwater trading post had introduced themselves with wagon handles and shouted words she had heard her whole life. She had not chosen the creek crossing that had soaked her to the waist in snowmelt, nor the 3 nights she had slept upright against a pine tree because she did not trust herself to sleep flat on unfamiliar ground. She had chosen none of it, but she was here, standing at the edge of a homestead fence made from split timber and iron staples, and she was absolutely, categorically going to turn around. The fence line was clear. Someone had built it with care, each post seated deep, each rail fitted snug. The field beyond it was freshly turned, the dark soil curling in long rows like ink drawn across parchment. There was a log cabin at the far end of the field, a real one, not the sagging limped variety she had passed twice on the trail north. This one had a stone chimney already smoking, a covered porch supported by 2 squared timbers, and a barn that actually had walls on all 4 sides. Whoever lived here had been here a while. Whoever lived here had roots. Roots meant permanence. Permanence meant neighbors who asked questions. Neighbors who asked questions about an orc woman traveling alone would eventually stop asking questions and start throwing things. Glasha turned. She got exactly 4 steps back toward the tree line before her left knee buckled. It was not a dramatic collapse. She did not fall. She caught herself on the fence post with both hands, her green fingers wrapping the rough-cut timber, and she stood very still and breathed through the hot spike of pain that climbed from her knee to her hip and back again. The creek crossing. 3 nights without real sleep. 1 meal in 2 days. Her body, which had carried her through worse, through the Ashfield War 4 years past, through the dispersal of her clan when the peace treaty had been signed in ink that benefited no orc alive, her body was simply informing her that it had reached an arithmetic conclusion about her current situation, and the conclusion was not favorable. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the tree line. She looked at her knee, which was trembling visibly through the worn leather of her travel breeches. She had not survived the Ashfield War by being stubborn to the point of stupidity. She had survived it by being practical. Glasha Ironblood let go of the fence post, straightened her spine, and walked toward the cabin with as much dignity as a limping, half-starved orc woman could manage. She was wearing the clothes she had left the Eastern Territories in, 3 weeks and 2 river crossings ago. Her leather bodice was dark green-brown, fitted close to her torso and laced tight with braided cord up the front, the kind that a woman wore when she needed her arms free and her back supported. Her blouse beneath it was cream-colored once, now closer to the color of creek sand, the fabric tucked into the waistband of her dark leather breeches. The breeches were good ones, snug-cut, reinforced at the knees and inner thighs for travel, stitched in double rows along the seams. She wore a short travel cloak over all of it, dyed with woad blue that had mostly faded to gray, fastened at her collarbone with a bone clasp carved in the shape of a running wolf, the only thing she had kept from her clan's dispersal. Her boots were tall, dark leather, worn smooth at the heel. She was tall by any measure, nearly as tall as most men in the frontier towns, and broader through the shoulder and chest in the way that orc women were built, compact muscle under green skin, her jaw a touch stronger than a human woman's, her lower canine teeth just slightly prominent without being monstrous. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face in a single thick braid that reached between her shoulder blades. Her eyes were amber, nearly gold, and they missed very little. She was, in the unguarded opinion of anyone who had actually looked at her rather than flinching away, a striking woman. She had been told this exactly twice in her adult life, both times by people who were dead now. She had stopped factoring it into her accounting of herself. She knocked on the cabin door with 3 clean knocks. Nothing happened for long enough that she began to reconsider. Then the door opened, and Luke Bailey looked at her. He was not what she expected, though she had learned long ago that expectation was mostly a way to be wrong efficiently. He was a few years older than her own 24 years, maybe 28, maybe 29, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and the kind of sun-darkened complexion that came from working outdoors without a hat as often as with one. He was broad across the shoulders, lean through the middle, with the particular worn-in look of a man who did physical work every day, and had been doing it long enough that it stopped showing as effort and started showing as shape. His jaw had a few days of dark stubble. His hands she noticed immediately, because Glasha Ironblood always noticed hands were large and calloused and clean, the hands of someone who worked hard and washed regularly, which combination she had found to be rarer than it should be. He was wearing a heavy canvas shirt, the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and rough-cut trousers tucked into work boots. There was fresh sawdust on his left forearm. He looked at her. She watched the sequence move across his face, surprise, then a flash of something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it, then something that was not quite recognition but was very close to assessment. He looked at her knee, which was still trembling. He looked at the tree line she had come from. He looked at her face. He said, "You need to sit down." It was not what she expected him to say. She had expected variations on a theme she knew well, the theme that generally started with "What are you doing here?" and ended with someone reaching for something that could be thrown. "I am fine," she said. Her voice was low and even. She had learned to keep it that way. "Your knee says otherwise," he said. He stepped back from the door, opening it wider. "Come in, I have got a kettle on." She did not move. "I am not asking for charity." "Good," he said. "I am offering coffee." "That is a different category." He waited. He did not push. He did not crowd the doorway. He simply stood back and left the decision entirely to her, which was also not what she expected. Glasha Ironblood stepped inside Luke Bailey's cabin. It was one room, clean and efficiently organized. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, the kettle hanging on its iron arm over a healthy fire. A wooden table with 2 chairs. A narrow bed along the left wall, neatly made with a wool blanket. Shelves built directly into the logs held tools, jars, a few worn books, a rifle on pegs above the door. The floor was swept flagstone. It smelled like pine smoke and coffee and sawdust, and underneath all of that, faintly, like lavender, from a small dried bundle hung beside the window that she doubted he had put there consciously. He pulled out the chair nearest the fire. She sat in it without arguing because her knee had begun to insist on it. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the kettle. He set one in front of her without asking how she took it. He sat down across from her with his own cup and did not stare at her. He looked at her in the way that people rarely looked at her, not away, not with the particular wide-eyed attention of someone cataloging her as a specimen, but simply forward, the way a person looks at another person they are trying to have a conversation with. "Luke Bailey," he said. "Glasha Ironblood," she said. "Where are you headed, Glasha Ironblood?" The question was simple and clean, and she had a simple, clean answer for it: north, to the mountain passes, to the few orc settlements that still held in the upper territories where the humans had not yet found the land worth taking. She had that answer ready. What came out was, "I do not know yet." He nodded as if this were a perfectly reasonable thing to say. "How long since you ate?" She did not answer. "Right," he said. He stood up and moved to the fireplace, and within a few minutes there was a cast iron pan on the grate, and the smell of salt pork and cornmeal joined the coffee smell. He cooked without ceremony. He put a plate in front of her. She ate slowly and with great dignity, which was a difficult combination to achieve when you were hungry enough to eat the plate as well. He did not talk much while she ate. He refilled her coffee. He sat with his own plate and ate without watching her, his eyes on the fire, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable in the way that silences usually were for Glasha Ironblood, which were generally silences that precluded violence. This one was just quiet. "What happened to your knee?" he asked when the plates were clear. "Creek crossing," she said. "The current was stronger than it looked. I caught a rock wrong on the far bank." He nodded. "May I look at it?" She considered this for a moment. "You are a healer. I am a farmer," he said, "but I have been out here 4 years. I have learned what I needed to learn." She extended her leg. He crouched beside the chair with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had looked at injuries before and was not going to make a performance of it. He pressed carefully around the joint, not invasively, reading the geography of it. His hands were warm. She noted this in the specific detached way she noted most things about him, because it was safer to catalog than to feel. "Not broken," he said. "Sprained. You need to rest it for a few days." He looked up at her. "You are welcome to stay until it is sound." "I am not looking for charity," she said again. "And I am not offering it," he said, in the same even tone he had used before. "I am looking at a first frost in probably 2 weeks, and my back field still needs to be brought in. My nearest neighbor is 6 miles east, and his 2 boys are hired out to the mill through winter. I could use another set of hands once that knee is up to it." She looked at him steadily. "You want to hire me? Fair wages," he said. "Roof, meals, and coin. You know what I am." He looked at her as if this were a strange thing to say. "I know you are a woman who crossed a creek in snowmelt and kept walking. That tells me enough." Glasha Ironblood sat in the chair by Luke Bailey's fire and turned this over in her mind for a long moment, turning it the way you turn a strange coin to find the face on it. She had learned to distrust easy kindness because easy kindness was often a preface to something else. But there was nothing in his face that she could read as calculation, and she had become very good at reading calculation. 2 weeks, she said. "Or until the field is in," he said. "Agreed," she said. She stayed 11 months. The first 3 days were rest, and Glasha was not a person who rested easily. She sat on the porch in the thin autumn sunlight and mended things, his harness leathers, 2 of the fence rails that had cracked, a split in the axe handle that he had been meaning to get to and had not. She had not asked. She had simply found the things that needed doing and done them. He noticed this but did not comment on it, which she found she appreciated. By the 4th day she could walk without limping. By the 5th she was in the back field with him. The back field was 3 acres of winter rye that needed cutting, bundling, and hauling before the frost came to cement it all in the earth. It was the kind of work that did not care about anything except whether you were willing to do it, and Glasha Ironblood had spent her life doing work that did not care about much of anything. She cut rye with the broad-bladed sickle he gave her, and she was faster at it than he was, which she could see surprised him though he covered it well, simply adjusting his own pace to keep even with her. They worked through the first week in mostly silence broken by short functional conversation. "The bundle goes here. The wagon needs turning. There is a storm coming from the North Ridge. We should get the last rows in before midday." The silence was not hostile. It was simply the silence of 2 people learning each other at a distance that felt safe to both of them. She slept on the narrow cot he had set up by the back wall, partitioned from his bed by a hanging blanket. She found this partition evidence of a kind of quiet respect that she had not expected to find on this farm, or anywhere within 3 days' ride of a human settlement. She did not mention it, but she noted it. She learned his routines. He was up before dawn, coffee on before light, and out to the animals. He had 6 chickens, 2 pigs, a mule named Ferdinand who was bad-tempered in the mornings and amiable afternoon, and a gray draft horse called Marit who was sweet-natured and very large. He split wood after the morning chores and before the field work, and she could hear the clean rhythm of it from wherever she was on the property, that particular percussion of axe on log that was the most fundamental sound of a working frontier homestead. She took over the morning chickens by the 2nd week without asking. She found she liked the chickens. They did not have opinions about her. He found her there one morning, crouched in the henhouse doorway, and he stood watching for a moment before she noticed him. When she did, she straightened immediately, already composing the explanation for the small indignity of being caught talking quietly to poultry. He said, "They lay better when you talk to them. My mother told me that. I thought she was joking, but she was probably right." Glasha said, "I was not talking to them." He looked at the three hens who were, in fact, clustered very close to her feet. "No," he said, "of course not." And the edge of his mouth curved in a way that she filed away in the back of her mind, that small particular smile, for reasons she did not examine closely. It was the end of the second week when she first heard the name for what she was going to be living inside. She had gone to the trading post at Copperfield, 4 miles south along the wagon road, the nearest one, a squat log building with a covered porch where three men sat on barrels drinking from clay cups in the weak afternoon sun. She had gone because Luke had a supply list and Ferdinand had pulled a muscle in his left shoulder and should not be worked hard, so she had walked. Luke had offered to come with her. She had said she was fine. She was fine until she stepped onto the trading post porch, at which point the three men on the barrels went quiet in the way that rooms went quiet when something unexpected walked through the door. One of them was older, gray-bearded, and said nothing. One of them was maybe her own age, sandy-haired, and looked at her with the particular expression of someone who could not decide whether he wanted to be afraid or insulting and was going to try both. The third one was somewhere between the two, and he was the one who said, "Orc woman, coming into Copperfield bold as noon, who gave you leave to walk the road." She had heard worse. She had heard very much worse. She kept her face neutral and said, "I am here on business for Luke Bailey." The sandy-haired one leaned back on his barrel. "Luke Bailey does not have orc business. Luke Bailey is a settler who keeps himself decent." "He appears to disagree," she said, "given that he sent me here." She moved toward the post door. The sandy-haired man stepped off his barrel and put himself between her and the door, not touching her, not yet, but occupying the space with the particular practiced ease of someone who had done this kind of thing before and found it satisfying. "Maybe," he said, "you can tell us what an orc woman is doing on a human road in a human valley, and we will decide whether your business is legitimate. Or," said a voice from behind Glasha, "you can sit back down on your barrel court and let the woman buy her flour." She turned. Luke Bailey was standing at the near end of the porch, having come up the road on foot without her hearing him. He was not particularly large. He was large enough, but the frontier made men of many sizes look the same size, but there was something in the way he stood that occupied more space than his actual dimensions. He had his hands loose at his sides. He was looking at the sandy-haired man, Court, with an expression that was not angry. It was something quieter and more final than angry. "Bailey," said Court, "this your orc?" "She is a woman working on my farm," Luke said. He walked up the porch steps and came to stand beside Glasha. Beside, not slightly behind her, not in front of her, but exactly beside, which also she noted and filed. "And she is here to buy supplies on my account." "You got a problem with that, Court? You can take it up with me after." Court looked at him for a long moment. The gray-bearded older man, who had not spoken, made a small dismissive sound and turned back to his cup. Court stepped back off the doorway. Luke held the trading post door open for her. She went inside. She bought what was on the list: flour, salt, dried beans, lamp oil, a new file for the draw knife. She worked through the list without looking at him, which was difficult because he was right beside her the whole time, navigating the narrow supply room with the casual ease of a man who knew exactly where everything was. The shopkeeper, an older woman with iron-gray hair and the careful face of someone who had watched enough frontier drama to stop being surprised by it, served them both without comment. Outside again, walking the road back north, Glasha waited until Copperfield's porch was out of sight before she spoke. "You followed me," she said. "I followed you about halfway," he said. Then I heard Court's voice and I walked faster. He was carrying most of the supply pack, having taken it from her at the door without asking, in a way that had been so seamless she had not protested it. I should have come with you from the start. I am sorry. She looked at him. You are apologizing to me. You should not have had to deal with that, he said. I have dealt with worse. That, he said quietly, does not make it better. It makes it worse. She did not have an answer for that. They walked in silence for a stretch, the pine forest pressing in on either side of the wagon road, a cold wind threading down from the northern ridge. After a while she said, "He called me your orc." "He is an idiot," Luke said flatly. "He is also more or less reflecting the general view of the valley." "The general view of the valley," Luke said, "has been wrong about most things since the first man drove a wagon through the pass and decided it all belonged to him." She looked at him again, this time for longer. He was watching the road ahead, his expression calm, the pack shifting easy on his shoulder. She said, "You are an unusual man, Luke Bailey." He glanced at her sideways. "Unusual how?" "Most men in this valley," she said, "would have taken Court's position without needing to think about it. Most men in this valley," he said, "have not gotten past the idea that their discomfort is more important than another person's dignity." He said it without heat, without performance, just as a plain statement of fact, the same way he said everything. Then he said, "You move fast when you are not favoring that knee. I had to actually hurry." She caught the very slight shift in his tone, the dry, quiet humor of it, and something in her chest made a small movement that she did not name. "I was not running," she said. "No," he said. "You were walking at a pace that would concern a horse." She did not smile, but she wanted to, and that was its own surprise. The frost came on a Wednesday in a hard white wave that turned the backfield silver overnight. By that morning the rye was in and stacked in the barn, and Glasha and Luke stood on the porch in the pre-dawn and watched the frost lay itself across the valley like a slow tide. Their breath made clouds. The fire was going inside, the cabin warm at their backs. "We made it," he said. "We made it," she agreed. He looked at her. She was watching the field, her arms crossed over her chest, and the early light was doing something very specific to the color of her skin, turning the green of it to something that caught bronze and amber in the thin gold of dawn, the frost breath curling from her lips. He looked away before she caught him at it. "The pay is in the tin on the shelf," he said. "I calculated the full 2 weeks plus the extra days." She was quiet for a moment. "The agreement was 2 weeks," she said. "The agreement was until the field was in," he said. "The field is in." She turned and looked at him. Something moved across her face that he had not seen there before, something complicated, with gratitude in it and pride in it, and something else below both of those that he could not name. "All right," she said. She went inside and took the tin from the shelf. She counted the coins and put them in the small leather purse she kept in her travel cloak. She put her cloak on. She picked up the pack she had arrived with, which was light. She had always traveled light, and she slung it over her shoulder. She went back to the door. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the door frame, looking back at the room, the fire, the 2 cups, the table, the hung blanket, the chair by the hearth that had become, without her meaning to let it, her chair. Luke was still on the porch. She could see his back through the small window. She opened the door. "Glasha," he said without turning around. She stopped. He turned then, and his face was the same as it always was, open, honest, not performing anything. "There is a root cellar under the barn that needs lining before the deep winter hits, and I have 3 cords of wood to split by December. And in spring the north field needs clearing if I am going to expand the plow line." She looked at him. "I am not good at asking for what I want," he said, "so I am telling you what the work is. But what I am actually asking is if you would stay." The morning light was fully up now, catching the frost on every surface and turning the whole valley to silver and gold. A hawk was turning slow circles above the north ridge, patient and unhurried. Somewhere in the barn, Ferdinand was making his morning complaints. Glasha Ironblood stood at the edge of his porch, her pack on her shoulder, the coin in her purse, the road south at her back. She was absolutely prepared to say no. She had the word assembled in her mouth, clean and simple. She said, What are the wages for root cellar lining? The sound he made was short and involuntary, somewhere between a breath and a laugh. Fair, he said. Define fair, she said. Same as before, he said. Meals, roof, and coin. The root cellar lining, she said, will take at least 3 days, and it is miserable cold work. Add a half coin per day for the cellar specifically. Done, he said immediately, and she saw the edge of that small smile again. She set her pack back down inside the door. Show me the cellar, she said. The root cellar was indeed miserable cold work. She lined it with stone and clay mortar over 4 days in air so cold her breath was a permanent fixture. And Luke worked beside her the whole time, passing stones, mixing mortar from the bag of lime he had in the barn, holding the lantern when she needed both hands free. They worked in close quarters, the cellar being the size of a large wardrobe. And by the end of the second day, she had stopped being hyper-aware of the proximity and started simply working, which was how she knew she had crossed some threshold she had not been looking for. On the 4th day, mortar-covered and cold-stiff, they climbed out of the cellar into the gray afternoon light, and Luke looked at her hands, clay-cracked and red at the knuckles from the cold, and went inside and came back with a small tin of rendered tallow mixed with something that smelled faintly of pine. He held it out. She took it without comment. She rubbed it into her hands, and the sting eased, and she handed it back. My grandmother's recipe, he said. She was a homesteader up in the high valley. Harder country than this. Where is she now? Glasha asked. Dead, he said simply. 15 years ago this winter. She made it to 72 in that valley, which the high valley considers an ordinary lifespan and everyone else considers a miracle. He paused. She would have liked you. Glasha looked at him. She would not have known what to make of me. She would have watched you work, he said, and then she would have decided she liked you. That was how she operated. He looked at the barn, the closed cellar door, the dull winter sky. She always said the most reliable measure of a person was not what they said, but what they did when the work needed doing. Glasha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, She sounds like someone worth knowing. She was, he said. And then quietly, most of the people I would have introduced you to are worth knowing in that particular tense. My father, my brother, the men I came out here with. The frontier takes people. She looked at him carefully. He had said this very plainly, without self-pity, but she heard what was under it. You have been here alone 4 years. 4 years and 3 months, he said. Why not go back to wherever you came from? He looked at the field, the frozen rows, the cabin with its smoking chimney. Because I built this, he said simply. My father always said that a man is what he builds more than what he inherits. I have not built enough yet to walk away from it. She looked at what he had built. The solid cabin, the well-seated fence, the barn with all 4 walls, the field that had been cut clean and stored against the winter. She said, You have built more than you think. He looked at her then directly, and the look held for a moment longer than their looks usually did. The cold air moved between them, carrying pine smoke and frost. Come inside, he said quietly. I will make dinner. She followed him in. The deep winter settled over the Clearwater Valley with the patient permanence of a glacier. The days shortened to thin gray slivers, and the nights stretched long and black, and full of stars that burned hard and clear in the cold. The wood splitting happened every morning, Glasha and Luke trading the axe back and forth in a rhythm that became almost musical over the weeks. The thok of iron on wood, the clatter of split pieces onto the pile, the small satisfied grunt when a difficult knot gave way. She learned things about him the way you learn things about someone you live close to, not through confession, but through accumulation. She learned that he was not much for talking in the mornings but came alive in the evenings by the fire. She learned that he read when he could. The 3 worn books on the shelf were not decorative, and that he read carefully, making small marginal notes in the dim lamplight. She learned that he was patient with Ferdinand to a degree that Ferdinand probably did not deserve, speaking to the mule in a low, constant murmur while working around him, which she had initially found slightly odd and now found quietly appealing. She learned that he had a fundamental, uncomplicated sense of fairness that governed everything he did, from the way he split tasks to the way he negotiated with the Copperfield trading post, and that this fairness was not strategic. It was simply how he was made. He learned things about her in the same slow accumulation. He learned that she woke up fully and immediately, no gradual surfacing, just eyes open and present, a habit from years of clan life where soft waking was not survivable. He learned that she was not comfortable accepting help until she had given help first, a kind of accounting that he eventually understood and stopped pushing against. He learned that she had an extraordinarily precise sense of spatial geometry. She could look at a stack of wood and tell him within a few pieces how many split logs it contained, and that she had a dry, oblique humor that she deployed rarely and without warning. He learned that she was missing something she did not talk about, that there was a grief in her that lived below the surface like deep water, cold and very still, and that she would not be led to it but might in time come to it herself. She did, on a night in late November when the wind had been screaming off the northern ridge for 3 days and the snow was piled against the cabin door and they were on their second evening of being, essentially, snowed in together. They had eaten. The fire was high. Luke was making his marginal notes in one of his books. Glasha was at the table with the harness leathers, not because they needed mending, but because her hands needed to be doing something. She said without preamble, "My clan dispersed 2 years after the peace treaty. The territory allocations were drawn by human commissioners who had never been east of the Ashfield River, and they drew lines that cut through the winter hunting grounds and the spring calving routes both. Within 3 seasons the eastern clans were starving." She said it in the same level voice she said most things, but her hands had stopped moving on the leather. Ironblood clan had 83 members at the treaty. We had 41 at the dispersal. The other 42 did not die in the war, they died after it. Luke had put his book down. He was looking at her. "I had a mother," she said, "and 2 brothers. One brother did not come home from Ashfield. My mother and my other brother, Vogue, they went north with the upper clan remnants 2 winters ago. I received word from a trader last spring that the northern passage had been bad that year. Very bad." She stopped. "That was the last word I received." The fire popped. Wind drove itself against the cabin walls with a sound like a large hand pressing flat. Luke said very quietly, "I am sorry, Glasha." She picked up the leather again. "I am telling you this," she said, "not because I want to be pitied. I am telling you because you have been honest with me about your losses and it seemed like the right balance." "It was," he said. "Thank you for telling me." She looked up at him then, across the table, across the firelight between them, and what she found in his face was not pity, it was recognition. The particular recognition of someone who also knew what it was to have the people you came from become past tense. She held his gaze for a moment and the fire did its slow work between them, and then she looked back down at the leather. But something had shifted and they both felt it, and neither of them named it. December brought a week of weather so brutal that even Ferdinand stayed inside without being asked. On the 5th day of that week, a sound came through the storm, not the wind, something else, something at the door. Luke opened it to find a man collapsed on the porch, a traveler who had come off the pass road and found the homestead purely by luck. He was barely conscious, near frozen, his feet in a state that made Luke's jaw set hard when he saw them. They brought him in. Glasha took the man's boots off. He cried out, and she spoke to him in the same steady voice she used with the animals. Quiet and anchored, and Luke heated water, and packed the worst of the frostbite with warm cloths. They worked in the kind of close choreography that only comes from having shared a space long enough to know where the other person is without looking. When Glasha reached for the water pan, Luke moved out of her way before she got there. When Luke was working on the man's left foot, Glasha was already doing the right one. The man, his name was Perrin, he told them hoarsely. A wagon trader from the southern towns drifted in and out for the first hours, and when he was finally stable and sleeping on the floor cot, Glasha and Luke sat at the table with their coffee and looked at each other. "Good work," Luke said. "You knew what you were doing," she said. I knew about half of what I was doing, he said. You knew the rest of it. I watched you with his right foot. Where did you learn that? The Ashfield War, she said. Frostbite was more common than arrow wounds in the Second Winter Campaign. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you were a fighter. I was a field medic, she said, which in that war meant I was both. He looked at her with that particular quality of attention he sometimes turned on her, not intrusive but very present. How long were you in it? 3 years, she said. I was enlisted at 19, not volunteered, enlisted. She looked at her coffee cup. Clan chiefs had conscription authority under the war charter. I had useful medical knowledge. I went. And after it was done, I came home to a clan that was smaller than it had been, and a territory that was smaller than it had been, and a world that was angrier than it had been in every direction. She looked up. And then the dispersal. And then north. And then a trading post in Coldwater where some men decided I was a convenient target for their opinions about orcs. She touched her ribs briefly, a gesture she had not made in front of him before. And then your fence line. He held very still. Coldwater, he said, that is 3 weeks' walk. I know how far it is, she said. Were you hurt, at Coldwater specifically? Were you hurt? She met his eyes. Nothing that did not heal, she said. The way his jaw moved told her that this answer was not satisfying to him, but he was not the kind of man who pushed past what was offered. He said quietly and with a specific gravity that was not empty, "You are safe here." She had heard similar things before, from people for whom it had been a prologue rather than a promise. She looked at him for a long time, reading everything she had learned to read in a face. What she found was not a prologue. I know, she said. Perrin the wagon trader stayed 4 days until the storm broke. He was a decent man under the frostbite and the shock mid-40s, weather-worn, with the chattiness of someone who spent most of his life alone on a wagon seat. He recovered quickly once he was warm and fed, and he watched Glasha and Luke with the observational habit of a man who drove roads where reading people was a survival skill. On his last morning, eating breakfast at the table before he set out on the cleared road, he looked at them both. At the easy way they moved around each other, at the 2 cups always ready before anyone asked, at the way Luke unconsciously tracked where she was in a room without looking, and he said, "How long have you 2 been together?" The question hit the cabin air and stayed there. Luke said, "She works the farm." "I see that," Perrin said cheerfully. "That is not what I asked." Glasha said, "Eat your breakfast, Perrin." He ate his breakfast, but he was smiling into it, and when he left he shook Luke's hand, and then he turned to Glasha and bowed his head with a small formality that surprised her. "Thank you for my feet," he said. "I mean that literally and entirely." "Keep them warm," she said. He laughed and walked out into the bright post-storm morning, and they listened to his bootsteps crunch away down the road. And then the silence of the homestead settled back around them, and neither of them said anything about what Perrin had asked. But it was there in the room, in the way winter things sit in a cold room, taking up no space, almost invisible and absolutely present. January was wood-splitting, animal tending, and the long, slow, deep cold that the Clearwater Valley bottom could produce in midwinter. A cold that was not dramatic but was relentless, the kind that crept under doors and into the seams of everything. They moved the cot that Glasha slept on closer to the fire, not by any conversation but by simple pragmatic adjustment as the temperatures dropped. The hung blanket between their sleeping spaces had been taken down and used as an extra layer on her cot during the worst of December's freeze, and it had not gone back up. The partition between his side and her side had simply ceased to exist, in the way that artificial boundaries cease to exist when the reality of a shared space makes them feel more performative than purposeful. Neither of them acknowledged this. Both of them were aware of it constantly. One night in mid-January, Glasha woke from a dream that she would not remember but whose emotional residue was the particular formless dread that sometimes follows a person out of sleep into the cold air of a frontier cabin at 3 in the morning. She lay still for a long time, listening to the wind and to Luke's slow breathing from the other cot, and she thought about her mother and her brother Vogue and the Northern Passage, and the way grief was not always loud. "Glasha," Luke said softly from the dark. She was startled. "I thought you were asleep." "I was," he said. "Then I was not." A pause. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "All right," he said, a long quiet. The fire was low, crackling softly. The wind pushed at the cabin walls with something like patience. "Luke," she said. "Yes. Do you ever regret it, coming out here, building this?" A long pause. "No," he said. "Not the coming and not the building." Another pause. "Some of the loneliness, but not the rest." She looked at the low-glowing fire. "I have spent most of the last 4 years being afraid," she said. "Not of anything specific, just afraid, underneath everything. It has been so long I stopped being aware of it. It was just the undertone of everything." "And now?" he asked softly. She was quiet for a moment. "It is quieter," she said. "Here, the fire, the wind, the long, warm dark." "Good," he said very quietly. "I am glad." She closed her eyes. She slept, and this time the dread did not follow her up. February thawed slightly toward the end, and with the brief thaw came the first mud, and with the mud came traffic on the wagon road. Traders who had been stormbound south of the Valley Pass coming through in a rush, their wagons heavy and their tempers short from weeks of delay. Luke went to Copperfield to handle supply trades 2 mornings in a row, and on the 3rd morning Glasha went with him because the trading post woman, whose name was Marta, had indicated through Luke that she wanted to speak with whoever had mixed the poultice used on the traveler's frostbitten feet, as she had 3 cases of trail injury waiting and no medical knowledge beyond rough bandaging. They walked into Copperfield together in the slush and mud of a February partial thaw, and the morning crowd on the trading post porch, larger now, with the road opening up, went through its usual performance. Glasha had learned to walk through it the way she walked through bad weather, chin up, pace steady, eyes forward, not looking for a fight and not looking away from one either. Court was there again, leaning on the porch rail with 2 men she did not recognize. He watched her come up the steps with a look that had over the weeks modulated from contemptuous to something that was still hostile but had acquired a grudging quality, the hostility of a man who has been told clearly and consistently that his position is not going to be accommodated and has not entirely accepted it. "Bailey," he said, not to her, to Luke beside her. "Court," Luke said pleasantly. "You are bringing her to town again." "She is her own person," Luke said, still pleasant. "She goes where she chooses." "Does she?" Court said, and there was something in the way he said it that raised the hair on the back of Glasha's neck, not directly threatening, but oriented that direction. Inside, Marta was brisk and businesslike and treated Glasha with the professional respect of one medically competent person for another. The 3 injured traders got cleaned and dressed wounds and specific instruction, and Marta paid Glasha in 2 clean coins for the consultation without being asked. Glasha took them. They were the first coins she had earned in this valley from anyone other than Luke. Outside again, the porch had acquired more people. It was market morning. Apparently, a loose gathering of the valley's scattered homesteaders that happened in the cleared space beside the trading post twice a month in winter. There were wagons, loose horses, clusters of people talking, children running in the mud. And there was Court, who had collected himself an audience and was standing in the cleared porch space with a quality of readiness that Glasha recognized. "I want to know," he said loudly, to no one in particular and clearly to everyone in general, "what the settlement committee has to say about an orc taking up permanent residence in the Clearwater Valley, because I seem to recall the settlement charter had language about that." The crowd settled into the particular stillness of people who are watching something they have been waiting for. Luke stepped forward. He was standing between Court and Glasha before Glasha had fully registered his movement. He was not touching anything, not his belt, not the rifle that he was not carrying because he had not thought he would need it for a supply run, and his hands were loose at his sides. But the thing about Luke Bailey that Court had perhaps not yet fully calculated was that he did not need to be threatening to be immovable. The settlement charter, Luke said, clearly, carrying his voice to the whole crowd with the ease of someone who was not afraid of being heard, states that no permanent resident may be denied tenancy without a formal committee hearing, filed notice, and a majority vote. Glasha Ironblood is in my employ and under the roof of my claimed land. She has the same legal shelter that any worker on any claim in this valley has. If you want to challenge that court, you file the paperwork and you wait for your hearing. He paused. I will see you at the hearing. The crowd was very quiet. Then the gray-bearded older man who had been there the first day, who had never once spoken in any of these exchanges, said without looking up from the fence post he was leaning on, "He is right about the charter. I was on the drafting committee. We wrote it specifically that way." He paused and took a drink from his cup. "Also, court, your creek fence is still blocking my east drainage, and I am going to stop being patient about it fairly soon." Mild, scattered laughter. The crowd breathed again. Court's face moved through several colors and settled on a mottled red that had no clear destination. Glasha, standing behind Luke's shoulder, said very quietly where only he could hear it, "You read the settlement charter." "I read it in October," he said, equally quiet, not turning around. "When I thought about what staying here might mean for you." She stared at the back of his head. The October in question was the first week she had been here. He had read the settlement charter in the first week she had been here. "Luke," she said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said. He turned then, and his face was close because they were standing close, and his expression had that openness in it that was specifically his. No performance, no calculation, just the face of a man who had done what seemed right and was not looking for credit for it. His eyes were very dark in the winter morning light. Her amber ones met them. "You are welcome," he said, very softly. The crowd had dispersed back into its market morning business. Court had removed himself. The gray-bearded man winked at Glasha from his fence post as they passed him, which was so unexpected she nearly stopped walking. "That is Harlan Birch," Luke said. "He has been here 15 years. He is the most sensible person in the valley and nobody listens to him." "He listened today," she said. "He always does," Luke said. "He just usually keeps it to himself." They walked home through the February mud with the supply pack and 2 extra coins and the particular quality of warmth that is not temperature-based. March came, and the light came back into the valley, and the first real thaw loosened the earth and filled the creek to its banks and brought geese over the ridge in long, uneven arrows headed north. Luke began planning the North Field expansion. Glasha began planning the spring garden. She had, over the winter, identified the south-facing bank beside the cabin as ideal soil and begun conditioning it with barn compost, which Luke had helped haul without being asked and without asking why. It was not a conversation. It was simply what was happening. The way spring was simply what was happening. The natural movement of a life that had, without either of them formally deciding it, become a shared one. There was an evening in late March when the light was long and gold, and the smell of turned earth was in the air for the first time since autumn. Glasha was on the south bank, working the soil with a fork, and Luke was fixing the fence rail on the north paddock. Marit the draft horse was loose in the paddock, doing her own slow patrol. Ferdinand was in the barn, because Ferdinand was always in the barn in March, and no amount of spring enthusiasm changed his opinion of mud. Luke finished the rail and came to lean on the paddock fence and watch Glasha work for a while. She was aware of him but did not stop working. The evening light was doing that specific thing again with the color of her skin, the thing that it had been doing since October, and that Luke had stopped pretending he did not notice. He pushed off the fence and walked to the south bank and picked up the spare fork leaning against the cabin wall and started working the next row over without saying anything. They worked in the easy silence that had become their primary language, that particular wordlessness that is only possible between people who have spent enough time together to be comfortable in each other's quiet. After a while she said, "The north field will be ready to break by end of next week if the weather holds." "It should hold," he said. "Cloud patterns look right. You read clouds." "My grandmother taught me," he said. "She was wrong about twice in 6 years." She glanced sideways at him. He was working the fork with that same unfussy competence he brought to everything. His hair was longer than when she had arrived, and the spring light had brought color back into his face. She was looking at him for a moment longer than she meant to, in the way she sometimes caught herself doing, and this time he glanced up from the fork and caught her at it. She did not look away. She held his gaze steadily, the way she did everything, and waited to see what happened. What happened was that neither of them looked away. The fork work stopped. The evening light held them both in its specific gold. The geese were calling somewhere over the ridge, high and wild and headed north, and the creek was running full below the south bank, and everything smelled like turned earth and spring water. Luke took 2 steps, and he was standing close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes, dark brown, the color of good soil, and his expression was the same open, honest, unperforming expression she had been reading for months, but there was something new in it now, something that was not any kind of mask and was not hidden at all. He said, "Glasha." Just her name, and the way he said it was enough. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, slow and deliberate, her calloused palm against the scruff of his jaw, and felt him go very still under her touch, the way something does when it has been waiting without knowing it was waiting. His eyes closed for just a moment and then opened again. "I did not come here looking for this," she said softly. "I know," he said. "I did not know this was possible," she said. "Something like this, here." "I know," he said again, and his hand came up and covered hers, warm and large and gentle, holding her hand against his face. "Neither did I." She looked at him for a long moment, reading everything she had learned to read, and finding everything she had been afraid to find, because finding it meant it was real. And it was real. It was completely real. She could feel his heartbeat through the pressure of his hand over hers. She kissed him, or he kissed her. In the moment it was both, 2 people leaning into each other at exactly the same time, and the kiss was slow and careful and very warm, the kind of kiss that is a first one but does not feel uncertain. It feels like a recognition, like a key finding a lock it has always fit, like finally arriving somewhere you did not know you were traveling to. The evening held them. The geese called overhead. The south bank smelled like spring. When they parted, there was a long, quiet moment where neither of them moved, still close, her hand still against his face and his over hers. He opened his eyes. She was already watching him. "All right," he said softly, which was not very romantic in the abstract, but in the specific context of Luke Bailey was precisely right. "All right," she said. He smiled, the full version, not the edge of a smile, but the whole thing, which she had not seen at that scale before, and which did something remarkable to his face and something equally remarkable to her chest. She smiled back. It was a small smile, very Glasha Ironblood, contained, controlled, but entirely genuine, and it reached her amber eyes and made them bright. Luke Bailey looked at that smile and understood completely, in the way you understand something when it stops being theoretical, that he was thoroughly and irretrievably in love with this woman, and that this had probably been true for some time, and that he was not at all sorry about it. April unfolded slowly and wonderfully. The north field got broken as planned, the 2 of them working Merritt through the long rows with Ferdinand hauling the supply cart alongside, and the work was the same as it had always been, except that everything was different. Not different on the surface. They still worked with the same efficiency, still spoke with the same practicality, but the silences had changed, had become warmer, and they moved around each other in the yard, and the cabin with a new and specific quality of awareness that was not disruptive but was constantly present. He brought her wildflowers the 2nd week of April, without ceremony. A bunch of early blooming wood violets from the creek bank, set in a jar of water on the table. She looked at them for a moment without speaking, and then she looked at him, and her expression had the particular quality that was difficult to read because it was layered gratitude and something tender and something that was almost protective. "Thank you," she said. He sat down at the table across from her as if he had not just put wild violets in a jar. "The creek bank is going to be full of them in another week." "I see that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up from his coffee cup and said, "You are still here." "I am still here," she agreed. "When I asked you to stay last autumn," he said, "I want you to know that I was not asking with any agenda. I was not asking because I expected anything from you. I want to make sure you know that." She looked at him steadily. "I know that," she said. "If I had thought you were asking with an agenda, I would not have stayed. If I had thought at any point that the position here was contingent on anything other than what I agreed to, the work, the wages, I would have been gone before the first frost." She held his gaze. "I stayed because I chose to stay. Everything that has come after is because I chose it. I want you to know that." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Something in his posture settled, a tension he had probably been carrying without fully knowing it. "Thank you," he said. "Also," she said, "the flowers are very nice." He did not quite laugh, but it was close. He built the door in May. It was a Saturday, she remembered afterward. She had been in the garden all morning, which had become her morning by that point. The South Bank garden was now a full-scale spring planting of vegetables and herbs, considerably more ambitious than anything she had originally planned, and she had plans to expand it along the east wall as well. She had gone inside at midday to find that Luke was not there, which was unusual for midday. She came back out and found him at the back of the cabin, in the small limped workshop he kept attached to the barn. He was building a door. Not the front door of the cabin, which was already solid and functional. This was a second door. The back wall of the cabin had always had a back window but no rear exit, which she had noted over the winter as a drafty inefficiency. He was building a proper door for the back wall, fitted with iron hinges he had ordered from the Copperfield trading post months ago, a solid planked door with a squared frame and a working latch. She leaned in the limped doorway and watched him work for a while. He was planing the door planks smooth with long, careful strokes, testing the flatness with his eye along the edge. He had not heard her come up. "You are building a door," she said. He looked up. A small pause. "Yes," he said. "For the back wall," she said. "For the back wall," he confirmed. She looked at the door planks, the iron hinges, the careful work. She said, "Luke, why?" He straightened from the plane. He looked at her with the expression she knew best from him, honest, direct, not hiding anything. "Because," he said, "the back wall faces the south garden, and the south garden is yours. You should have a door that is yours, that goes to your garden, that you can go in and out of on your own terms without going through the whole house first." She stared at him. "It is a practical improvement," he said. "Also, I got a good deal on the hinges." She crossed the distance between them, and she took his face in both her hands and she kissed him with a thoroughness that left no ambiguity about her feelings on the subject of the door or anything else. He made a small, warm, surprised sound and then kissed her back with equal and growing thoroughness, the plain handle resting forgotten against his leg. When she drew back, he was looking at her with that full smile, the complete one. "It is a very good door," she said. "I have not finished it yet," he said. "It will be a very good door," she said. He finished it the following Thursday. It fit the back wall with the precision of a man who did not build things carelessly. It had a good latch, solid hinges, and he had carved a small running wolf into the upper panel, barely an inch tall, so discreet you might miss it, and so deliberate you would not once you had seen it, like the wolf on her bone cloak clasp. She stood in the garden and looked at the door, her door, the door he had built and called hers. She stood there for a while, just looking at it. When she went inside through the front door, Luke was at the fire, and she walked past him to the back wall, and she opened the back door from the inside and let it swing wide to the evening garden and the warm May air. And she stood in the doorway for a moment, one hand on the frame. Then she closed it gently and turned around. "Luke," she said. He looked up from the fire. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "I want you to know that. I am not standing at the edge of your land anymore. I am standing in the middle of it, if that is what you want." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "That is what I want." She crossed the room. He stood up from the fire and they met in the middle of it, not dramatically, just completely. her arms around his neck and his around her back and her face against his shoulder and his face against her hair, and they stood like that in the warm firelight in the May evening and the smell of the south garden coming faintly through the cracks around the new door. "I love you," he said into her hair. She pressed closer. "I know," she said. And then, after a moment, very quietly, "I love you." He held her tighter. Summer was the best summer Luke Bailey had ever spent on the Clearwater Valley homestead, by a margin that was not even competitive. The north field expanded beautifully. The garden was producing things in quantity and variety that he could not have managed alone, and Ferdinand had, in the baffling way of ill-tempered animals who encounter someone more stubborn than themselves, entirely reformed his morning behavior in the presence of Glasha, and now came to the paddock gate for her without being asked. They built a second garden bed along the east wall together, extending the stone border and filling it with the black creekbank soil that Glasha had identified over the winter. They talked about a root house, a proper one, separate from the cellar, built into the hillside north of the barn, which was the right construction for the volume of winter vegetables the garden was going to produce. They talked about a second animal shelter for when Luke eventually acquired more livestock. These were conversations about the future. They were also simply conversations, said in the natural way of two people who lived together and thought about the same things. Glasha noticed this, the ease of it, the complete absence of the particular alertness she had carried for years, the readiness to be unwelcome. She was not unwelcome here. She had not been unwelcome here since the day she had knocked on the door and he had said, "You need to sit down." They argued, because two competent people living and working in close quarters argue. They argued about the spacing of the North Field rows. She was right about that one. They argued about whether the eastern fence line needed replacement before winter. He was right about that one. They argued, briefly and with some heat, about an incident in late June when she had gone to Copperfield alone and encountered court again. This time with men she did not know, and one of them had put a hand on her arm. She had handled it efficiently, and without lasting damage to anyone, but Luke's face when she told him about it went through a sequence of expressions that ended in a very specific quiet that was not calm so much as it was extremely controlled. "You should have waited for me," he said. "I should not need to wait for you every time I want to walk 4 miles to a trading post," she said. "That is true," he said, "and also that is not what I said. I did not say you need me there. I said you should have waited for me, because I want to be there, not because you cannot handle yourself." She looked at him. The heat of the argument had been in the room a moment ago. It was dispersing. "Because you want to be there," she said. "Because I want to be there," he said. He was not hiding anything. He was never hiding anything. "Because you are the person I want to be next to." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right, next time ask me to wait." "I will," he said, "and I will tell you whether I am going to or not," she said, the edge of that smile. "Fair enough," he said. They went to Copperfield together after that, generally. It was not an arrangement anyone demanded. It was simply where they both preferred to be, relative to the other. The valley's opinion of Glasha Ironblood underwent a slow and uneven evolution over the summer. Harlan Birch, the gray-bearded man who had invoked the settlement charter on the porch that February morning, became something of an unlikely ally, not through any campaign on his part, but through the simple mechanism of being a man who had lived in the valley for 15 years and whose opinion people heard. He came to the homestead once in June with a cracked wagon axle, and Glasha was the one who identified the exact nature of the crack and told him how to fit the replacement piece, and he left with a working wagon and a slightly different expression than the one he'd arrived with. Marta at the trading post had been matter-of-fact since February. She began directing trail injuries and minor medical cases to Glasha when she could, quietly, without fanfare, and paying fair rate for the consultations. There were still people in the valley who crossed to the other side of the road when Glasha walked past. There was still Court, who had become hostile in a resigned, low-level way, like a man who has argued a case and lost it but has not updated his fundamental position. There would probably always be people like Court. The valley was not a transformed place. It was simply a place where two people had made themselves a life, and the life was, over time, making its own kind of argument. In September, a month before the first anniversary of Glasha's arrival on Luke's land, a party of 4 orcs came through the Clearwater Valley pass heading south from the upper territories, road-weary and provisioned but threadbare, the kind of traveling that meant something had changed in the north. Glasha saw them from the north field and recognized the travel posture, the specific watchfulness of orcs moving through human-dominant territory, the space between themselves that said their trust in everything around them was thin. She crossed the field to the wagon road and went to them. Luke from the north field saw the exchange, could not hear it but could see Glasha standing with the 4 orcs, then the way all 4 of them looked toward the homestead when she gestured toward it. He went inside and put the kettle on. She brought all 4 of them in. Their names were Dura, Kessin, and 2 young men who were brothers, Valk and Pesh. They were from the upper territories, from the Northern Passage settlements. They had news. The Northern Passage settlements had not been as bad as the trader's word had suggested last spring. They had been bad, but not total. A hard winter and a worse spring, significant losses but not annihilation. Dura, who was clearly the leader of this small group, was carrying a carved wooden token from the upper settlement leader, a formal messenger's token, which meant she had been authorized to carry word south. The word was that the upper settlements were requesting contact with any dispersed clan members who had made their way into the western and southern territories. And Glasha said, quietly, "My mother, and my brother Vogue. Are they?" Dura looked at her. "Your mother I do not know," she said carefully. But there was a Vogue Ironblood in the Northern Passage settlement as of last spring. He was well. He was asking after his sister who had gone south. The room was quiet. Luke at the fire with his own cup did not speak. He waited. Glasha sat with this for a long moment. Her hands were flat on the table. Her amber eyes were very bright. "He is alive," she said. "As of last spring," Dura said. "The roads from here to there are long." "I know how long they are," Glasha said. She looked at Luke. He was watching her with the open, patient expression that was his, not pushing, not anxious, just there. She looked at him for a long time. "I would like to send a letter north," she said, "with these travelers as far as they go toward the upper territories. Marta at the trading post keeps a letter relay with the northern road traders," Luke said. "We can ask her about the route tomorrow." "We," Glasha said. "We," he said simply. She looked at the fire for a moment. She looked at Dura and the other 3 who had the quiet diplomatic blankness of travelers watching something that was not their business and not pretending otherwise. She looked at Luke. "I would like to ask them to stay tonight," she said. "I was already assuming they would," he said. She said something to Dura in the orc tongue. Glasha rarely used it, the language of a clan dispersed, but it was hers. It was home in her mouth in the way that is specifically language and not anything else. And Dura's expression shifted, some guarded quality releasing slightly. They talked for a few minutes, and Luke made dinner for 6 people with an efficiency that impressed all 4 orcs, who had clearly not expected this. And they ate and talked through the evening. And it was late when the 4 travelers settled for sleep on floor mats that Luke had produced from the barn with the matter-of-fact generosity that was simply the way he did things. Later, in the quiet of the cabin with 4 people breathing softly around them, Glasha and Luke lay close in the warmth of the fire, face to face in the dark, speaking in the near silence of people who do not want to wake anyone else. "Your brother is alive," he said softly. "Possibly," she said. "He was alive last spring. That is not nothing." "No," she said, "that is not nothing." She was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking about him for 2 years as though he were gone. I had closed it, and now it is open again." "Is that bad?" he asked softly. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "It is terrifying, but no." He reached across the small space between them and found her hand in the dark and held it. She held it back. His thumb traced across her knuckles, slow and warm, and she closed her eyes. "If he is there," she said, "if he can be reached, I would want him to know where I am." "We will find a way to reach him," Luke said. "It might take time," she said. "We have time," he said. She opened her eyes in the dark and found his face close and warm and certain. "We have time," she said, and the "we" was the whole of it. The cabin and the field and the South Bank garden and the back door with the small carved wolf and the chickens who liked her and Ferdinand who had reformed and everything that had been built in this valley, the whole of the life they had made here together. She leaned forward and kissed him softly, and he kissed her back in the warm dark, and they lay close with their hands together until she slept. The letter to Vogue went north with a relay trader in October. They wrote it together. She dictated and he wrote, because his hand was faster and cleaner, and she told him what to put down in careful plain language. That Glasha Ironblood was alive, was well, was in the Clearwater Valley of the Western Territories at the homestead of Luke Bailey, and could be reached through the Copperfield Trading Post relay. That she was, by every meaningful measure, home. October brought the 1-year anniversary of her arrival, though neither of them marked it formally. It marked itself, in the way that anniversaries mark themselves. The frost came the same week it had come the year before, and Glasha stood on the porch in the pre-dawn and watched the valley go silver, and Luke stood beside her, their shoulders touching, both of them with their coffee cups, and they did not say anything because nothing needed to be said. The autumn harvest was the best the homestead had produced. The Northfield had yielded well, the garden had been extraordinary, and Glasha had, in addition to her ongoing medical work through Marta at the trading post, developed a small trade in specific dried medicinal herbs that grew on the South Bank, dried and packaged and sold to the trading post relay for distribution. It was a modest income alongside the farm income, but it was hers, a thing she had built from nothing, from knowledge she had carried and applied. She was building, she thought. Like Luke had said about himself, "You are what you build." The evenings of October were long and fire-warm. They read together sometimes. Luke had acquired 2 new books from a traveling book trader in September, and Glasha had turned out to be a reader herself, methodical and specific, making her own marginal notes in a hand that was smaller and more precise than his. They talked more than they had in the winter, not from any increase in the need to fill silence, but simply because there was more to say, more to think about together, more of the future to articulate. One evening in mid-October, Luke looked up from his book and said, without any particular preamble, "I want to marry you." She looked up from her own book. "I have been thinking about how to say this for a while," he said, with the expression of a man who is saying something important and being exactly himself while he does it. "And I concluded that anything elaborate would not be me and you would see through it. So I am telling you plainly, I want to marry you, if you want to marry me." She held his gaze for a long moment. This was a large thing to hold, larger than the door, larger than the winter, larger than almost everything else that had been said in this room. She turned it in her mind the way she turned important things, looking for the face on it. There was no deception on it. There was no agenda on it. There was only Luke Bailey, sitting across the fire from her, being exactly himself, wanting exactly what he said he wanted. "The Valley Committee," she said, "they may not recognize a mixed marriage." "I wrote to the Territorial Commissioner in August," he said. "I have a reply from his office dated 3 weeks ago. A legal marriage in the territory requires 2 witnesses and a record filed with the nearest commerce post. There is no species restriction in the current territorial code." The reply confirmed it. She stared at him. "You wrote to the Territorial Commissioner." "In August," he said. "Luke, I was not sure you would say yes," he said. "I wanted to have the information regardless." She set her book down. She looked at him across the fire, this man who had read the settlement charter when she had been here a week, who had written to the Territorial Commissioner in August, who had built her a door with a wolf carved into it, who had put the kettle on when 4 orcs came down the road, who had held her hand in the dark and said, "We have time," like it was the simplest and most obvious thing in the world. Yes, she said. He breathed. The breath was a full one, the kind that releases something you have been holding a long time. Yes, he said. Yes, she said. I will marry you, Luke Bailey. He was across the room before she had finished the sentence, and he pulled her to her feet and kissed her properly, thoroughly, with both hands on her face, and everything he had not found the elaborate words for expressed in the specific warmth and weight of it. She kissed him back with equal and growing warmth, her hands in his hair, and the fire was bright, and the cabin smelled like pine smoke and coffee, and the dried lavender from the bundle beside the window. They were married on a Saturday in late October, in the cleared yard in front of the cabin, in the gold and red of an autumn morning. The witnesses were Harlan Birch, who had found a clean coat for the occasion and looked as near to pleased as his weathered face would allow, and Marta from the trading post, who had brought a jar of her own-made preserves as a gift and had the pleased expression of a woman who had seen this coming and was vindicated. The record was filed at the Copperfield trading post that afternoon in Luke's clean hand with both their names, Luke Bailey and Glasha Ironblood Bailey. It said, though Glasha had specified that she was keeping Ironblood as well, hyphenated after in the record Glasha Ironblood Bailey, which was formally who she was from that day forward, and which she found she liked the sound of completely. Court was not there. Nobody had invited Court. This was a decision that was both intentional and entirely comfortable. The winter that followed the wedding was different from all the other winters Luke Bailey had spent on the homestead, not because anything dramatic happened in it, but because nothing needed to. They were simply married, and winter, and in the cabin that was theirs, with the fire and the 2 cups and the back door with the carved wolf and Ferdinand complaining in the barn and Merritt patient in the paddock, and the chickens who liked Glasha more than they had ever liked Luke, which he admitted freely and without resentment. The particular intimacy of a shared life that was now entirely and formally a shared life. The way it settled, the warmth of it that was not just fire warmth, was the kind of thing that Glasha turned over in her mind on the cold nights and found every time to be real. Not a provisional thing. Not a thing contingent on good behavior or useful labor or keeping herself small enough to be acceptable. Real and hers and his. On the first snow night of December, they lay together in the warmth of the bed, a proper bed now, wider than the old one that Luke had built in November, and the cabin was quiet around them, and the snow was doing its slow work on the world outside, and there was nowhere either of them needed to be. He had his arm around her and her head was against his shoulder, and they were simply there, which was its own entire abundance. She said softly, "I never thought a place could feel like this." He turned his head slightly, his lips against her hair. Like what, he said. She thought about the word. She had several languages, and the right word was in none of them precisely, but the nearest one was safe, she said, and mine, both at once. I did not know those 2 things could be the same place. He pressed his lips to her temple, slow and warm. They are, he said, and they will be. She closed her eyes, the snow fell, the fire held. In February the letter came. It came via the trading post relay. 3 transfers north, which was a remarkable piece of logistics, and it was in a hand that Glasha did not immediately recognize because it had been 4 years since she had seen it, and in 4 years a person's hand changes. But the name at the bottom was Vogue, and the orc letter characters beside it, which she had taught him when he was 7 years old, were unmistakably his. She sat at the table and read it twice without speaking. Luke, who had been at the fire, came to sit across from her and waited. She looked up. Her eyes were bright in the way they had been the night Dura had brought the news, that particular brightness that was a specific kind of feeling trying to find its shape. "He is alive," she said. "He is in the northern settlement. He has a woman. He does not give her name yet. He is being circumspect, which means he is not sure yet, which means he is absolutely sure and is embarrassed about it. He received my letter in November. He is," she stopped. She swallowed. "He says he thought I was gone. He says he spent a year thinking I was gone. And now he knows," Luke said quietly. "And now he knows," she said. She held the letter for a long time. Then she set it carefully on the table, smoothed it flat, and looked at Luke. "I want him to come here," she said. "When the pass is open, when it is safe to travel, I want him to see this." She meant the cabin, the farm, the South Bank garden, the door with the wolf on it, all of it. She meant Luke. "I want him to see you. We will write back today," Luke said. "Tell him the road and the relay and that he is welcome whenever he is ready. He will need time," she said. "The upper settlements are still fragile. He will not leave easily." "That is all right," Luke said. "We have time." She looked at him across the table, the letter between them, February light coming through the window. She said, "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true," he said. Spring arrived, and with it all the work that spring requires on a frontier homestead. The thaw clearing, the first plow line, the garden beds, the animal schedules shifting as the days lengthened. The north field was expanded again, this time into a section of the adjacent slope that Glasha had been watching all winter and had determined was plantable after some drainage work. They did the drainage work together over 3 weeks in March, and by April the slope was turned and ready. Marta at the trading post began formally calling Glasha's herbal products Ironblood Bailey medicines on her stock board, which was both the most practical and the most affecting recognition the valley had produced to date. Old Harlan Birch, who had taken to stopping at the homestead on his regular road journeys with the specific pretext of having something to ask Luke about, and who never in fact had anything to ask about, began openly referring to Glasha as Luke's wife, to anyone who asked and most people who did not, with the calm authority of someone who has decided a thing is settled. Court left the valley in May, for reasons that had nothing to do with Glasha and everything to do with a debt situation he had managed to create with 3 separate creditors. Nobody was particularly sorry about this. Vogg's second letter arrived in May, longer than the first. He was doing well. The northern settlement was stabilizing. The woman he had not named in the first letter he named now Keth, a settlement-born Orc woman from the Arrowwood clan remnant, and the letter said simply that they were together and would be for a long time, in a way that communicated everything through its brevity. He said he hoped to travel south before winter. Glasha read this letter to Luke in the evening, translating as she went, and he listened with the quality of attention he brought to everything complete and real. When she finished, he said, "He writes like someone who does not say more than he means." "He is very much like me," she said. Luke smiled, the full version. "Then I will like him," he said. She looked at him with that small, real, completely genuine smile of her own. "He will like you," she said. "He will not admit it immediately, but he will like you." "I can wait," Luke said. In June, Glasha told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, matter-of-factly, before coffee. She had worked it out over the previous 2 weeks and verified it with the knowledge she had as a medic. And she had then sat with it privately for 3 more days before deciding that sitting with it privately was a strange thing to do when the person you would most like to talk to was right there. He was by the fire when she came down from the sleeping loft and said, "I'm going to have a child, our child, in approximately 7 months." The sound he made was not articulate. He set the coffee pot down with great care, the way you set things down when your hands have suddenly become unreliable, and he turned around and looked at her. His face was doing something extraordinary. "Luke," she said. He crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled her into his arms, and held her with the fierce, careful intensity of someone holding something they love so much that fear and joy have become the same feeling. She held him back, her face against his neck, and felt the way he was breathing deeply, slowly, with great effort. "All right," he said, his voice a little rough. "All right," she said. 7 months, he said. "Give or take," she said. "We need another room," he said. "Off the north wall, a proper room with a window." "Luke," she said with some amusement. "There is time." "There is time," he said, "but I am building the room." He built the room. He built it over 2 months in the summer, framing and raising and roofing it in the same careful, unfussy way he built everything, with Glasha's architectural input. She had opinions about window placement that turned out to be entirely correct, and Harlan Birch's assistance for the roof raising, which required more hands than two. The room was attached to the north wall, and it had a window that faced east to catch the morning light, and it smelled, when it was done, like new wood and possibility. The summer deepened and Glasha's shape changed gradually, and she moved through the farm's work the way she moved through everything, with the practical assessment of what was still reasonable to do and the pragmatic adjustment when it was not, and the characteristic stubbornness about what she could handle, until Luke very gently pointed out that he had read extensively about this, and would she please not carry the full grain sacks up the barn stairs. She conceded the grain sacks. She did not concede the garden. Vogue arrived in September. He came in a supply wagon that was going south. He had found a place on it out of the northern settlement relay, which showed that he had prepared the journey carefully and taken no unnecessary risks, which was entirely Vogue. The wagon came up the homestead road in the mid-afternoon, and Glasha was in the garden when she heard it, and she stood up and shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun and watched the figure climb down from the wagon board. He was taller than she remembered. Or she had remembered him as younger, and time had added something. He was solidly built, darker complected than her, with the same amber eyes and the same jaw, and he stood in the homestead yard in the September afternoon looking at the cabin and the barn and the north field and the south garden, and the woman standing in the garden with her hands on her hips and her hair in its thick braid. And his face did the thing that Vogue Ironblood's face did when he felt something deeply, which was to do as little as possible while containing an ocean. She crossed the yard. He crossed the yard. They met in the middle, and she put her arms around her brother, and he put his arms around her, and they stood there in the September afternoon in the homestead yard. And whatever the last 4 years had been, the war's aftermath, the dispersal, the grief of not knowing, the long, terrible silence. It was not resolved. It could not be resolved, but it was held now, held between two people who had both made it through and were both still here. Luke came out of the barn because he had heard the wagon, and he stood at a respectful distance until Glasha turned and held out her hand to him, and he came forward. She said, "Vogue, this is Luke Bailey." Vogue looked at him with the specific measuring quality of a brother and a warrior who has been worrying about his sister for 4 years. Luke met the look directly, openly, which was how Luke met everything. "Ironblood Bailey," Vogue said. "My sister's name on the letter." "It is," Luke said. "She is well," Vogue said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. "She is extraordinary," Luke said simply. Vogue held the look for a long moment. Then he said, "I will need to see how you work before I form an opinion." "Fair," Luke said. Vogue looked at Glasha's silhouette, the changed shape of her, now clearly evident. He looked at her face. Something moved across his. "You are going to be an aunt or uncle in approximately 2 months, she said. He breathed in slowly. Then, "Mother would have," he stopped. "I know," she said. "She is alive, by the way," Vogue said carefully. "I should have led with that. I did not know how to lead with it. She made it through the hard winter. She is in the northern settlement. She is old now, Glasha, but she is alive." The yard was very quiet for a moment. Glasha stood very still. Then she sat down on the nearest fence rail because her knees had made a decision, and Luke was beside her immediately, his hand on her back, steady and warm. "Alive," she said. "Alive," Vogue said. She covered her face with her hands for a moment, just a moment, and then she dropped them and looked up at the September sky, which was very blue and very clear and had no particular opinion about anything, which was exactly what she needed it to have. "We need to write to her," she said. "I have her letter in my bag," Vogue said. "She sent it with me when she heard I was traveling south." Glasha looked at her brother. "You have a letter from our mother." "In my bag," he said. "Then why," she said, with the specific exasperation of someone who is crying and trying not to, "did you not say so immediately?" "I told you," he said. "I did not know how to lead with it." Luke, beside her, made a very small sound that was not quite a laugh. Vogue looked at him. Then slowly, something at the edge of Vogue's expression shifted, not quite a smile, very much a Vogue Ironblood version of a smile, which was to say a barely perceptible easing of severity that communicated everything. Glasha saw it and felt, despite herself and everything, something unlock in her chest that had been locked for a very long time. Vogue stayed 3 weeks. He was quiet and watchful in the way that people are when they are assessing a new landscape. But by the end of the first week, he had taken over the morning wood splitting with the single-minded efficiency of a man who found satisfaction in the percussion of it. And by the end of the second week, he and Luke had established a working relationship that was communicatively sparse and functionally seamless, which was the highest compliment either of them was capable of paying. On the third week's last evening, they sat on the porch in the autumn dusk, all three of them with their cups, and Vogue said, looking at the valley, "You have built something real here." "We have," Luke said. Vogue looked at him. "I said that to you," he said. "I know," Luke said, "but it is hers as much as it is mine, more in some ways. She built things here that I did not know how to build." Vogue looked at his sister. Glasha looked at the valley and said nothing because she was not going to cry in front of her brother twice in a fortnight. "Good," Vogue said. He paused. "I will come back in spring with Keth." "We will have a room ready," Luke said. Vogue looked at the cabin, the north wall room with its east window, still smelling of new wood. He nodded once, with the precision of a man whose approval is not given lightly and was just given. He left in the morning, catching a relay wagon north. Glasha stood in the yard and watched him go, and Luke stood beside her, and when the wagon was out of sight she leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the autumn morning that smelled like turning leaves and wood smoke and cold water and the particular specific air of a place that was home. "Your mother," he said softly. "I will write back today," she said. "A proper letter, not the short one." "We will write it together," he said. "You always say we," she said. "I always mean it," he said. The child came in November, on a night when the first real snow of the season was falling, and the fire was high, and Marta from the trading post had come out, as arranged, because she had the most medical knowledge available, and Glasha had entirely practically, without sentimentality, requested her presence. Luke was there completely, the whole time, which was not the frontier custom and was entirely Luke Bailey. The child was a boy. He was not entirely orc and not entirely human, and was entirely himself. A little bigger than a human baby at birth, a very pale green at his skin, with dark eyes that would settle into their final color over the coming weeks. He had a full head of dark hair and a grip that surprised everyone, which Vogue would later say was genetic, and he would not be argued out of it. Luke held him in the firelight of the November night, this person who was new in the world, this whole person made of both of them, and his face had the expression of a man for whom language had entirely given up. Glasha, watching from the bed, said, "Well," he looked up at her. His eyes were wet. He was not hiding this at all because he was Luke Bailey and he did not hide things. "Well," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. "He needs a name," she said. They had discussed names at great length over the preceding months, with the particular seriousness of people who know that a name given to a person becomes part of that person forever. They had a short list. "Wren," Luke said, "after my grandmother, Wren Bailey Ironblood." She had not expected him to put Ironblood in it. She had expected to negotiate it, to argue it in, to make the case. He had simply put it there. She looked at him holding their son. She said, "Wren Bailey Ironblood." "Both his parents' names in his," Luke said simply. "That seems right." She reached out her hand. He came and sat beside her, and she held her son, and Luke's arm came around her shoulders, and they sat in the warmth of the fire, the three of them, on the night of the first snow of the season. And outside the world was white and cold and immense, and inside the cabin was exactly the right size. Wren Bailey Ironblood grew through the winter with the speed that children produce, which is remarkable and constant. He was round and curious, and operated under the impression that Ferdinand was a personal friend, which Ferdinand bore with much more patience than he extended to adults, which said something about Ferdinand that nobody had expected. He had his father's brown-dark eyes, ultimately, and his mother's amber-green undertone in his skin, and a particular expression when he was working out something he did not understand that was so specifically Glasha that it made Luke laugh every time he saw it. The letter to Glasha's mother, sent in November, received a reply in March, carried again by the Northern Relay, a chain of traders and post-riders across 200 miles of spring-thawing country. The letter was in a hand that shook slightly, which was age, and was written with a care that was specifically a mother's care, every word placed deliberately. It said, among other things, that she had heard from Vogue about Luke Bailey, and that she was grateful beyond the words she had available in any language for the safety of her daughter, and that she hoped to see the valley one day when the roads were good enough and her joints permitted, and that the name Wren was a good name, a strong name, the kind of name that a child could grow into without being crowded by it. Glasha read this letter in the garden, on a warm March morning with Wren on a blanket nearby making his opinions about the chickens known, and Luke was at the fence line visible from where she sat, and the valley was beginning its green return, and the life they had made was everything they had built it to be, not perfect, not smooth, not without the ordinary friction and hardship of a frontier homestead, and a world that was still learning what it thought of them, but real, solid, irretrievably theirs. Vogue came in May with Keth, who was a compact, sharp-eyed orc woman from the Arrowwood remnant with a quick, dry sense of humor that matched Vogue so well they seemed to have been assembled from the same kit. She took one look at the homestead and said to Glasha, "You built the garden on the south bank. That is good placement." And Glasha knew immediately that she liked her. They stayed a full month. Luke and Vogue expanded the east paddock together, working in the same spare-spoken, efficient way they had established in September. Keth and Glasha worked the garden and talked, really talked, in the orc language, and in the common tongue both, the way women who have been through hard things talk when they find each other, with the specific candor of people who have stopped pretending that things are softer than they are, and the equal specific warmth of people who have found things that make the hardness worth it. One evening near the end of the month, all four adults were on the porch with Wren between them in the long golden light of May, and Keth said, "We are going to stay south. Not here necessarily, but south, closer to this." She said it to Vogue, but she was looking at the valley when she said it. Vogue looked at Luke. "The Harlan Birch parcel," he said. "The old man mentioned he might sell the east section when I was here in September. Is he still considering?" "I can ask him," Luke said. "Ask him," Vogue said. Luke asked him. Harlan Birch, who was 70 years old and getting increasingly practical about which of his land he could work alone, sold the east section to Vogue and Keth in July for a fair price and 2 years of seasonal labor assistance, which was a deal everyone found satisfactory. By autumn there was a second homestead going up on the Clearwater Valley's east road, smaller than Luke's, built in a hurry before winter but solid, with Vogue's precision in every joint. The valley was not transformed. It was not suddenly a place of universal welcome. It was a frontier valley, hard-edged and unapologetic, and it held its share of people who would never update their fundamental positions. But it was also a valley where Glasha Ironblood Bailey had a medical practice out of the Copperfield trading post, and where Marta's stock board said Ironblood Bailey Medicines in neat chalk letters, and where old Harlan Birch had sold land to an orc couple because he found them sensible and capable, and where a boy named Wren Bailey Ironblood played in a South Bank garden on summer mornings and thought Ferdinand was his friend, and had never in his short life been given any reason to think the world was other than what it was here, complicated and difficult and full of work, and also full of this specific warmth that was two people who had found each other against the odds of a world that did not make it easy. The second winter came and went. The spring after it came, and Glasha found herself pregnant again, which she reported to Luke in the same matter-of-fact before-coffee way she had reported the first, and his response was the same, the careful setting down of the coffee pot, the face doing the extraordinary thing, the arms around her. "Another room," he said. "Another room," she agreed. "Or we build on," he said. "Properly, extend the north wall the full length." "That is a summer project," she said. "We have the summer," he said. They had the summer. The second child was a girl, born at the turn of the following spring, in the room they had built and extended, a room that now had 2 windows and smelled permanently like the dried lavender Glasha kept in bundles on the sill. She was smaller than Wren at birth, darker in her skin tone with Glasha's amber gold eyes, and she screamed about being in the world with an immediate and fully committed conviction that made Marta laugh and made Wren, who was 2.5 and had been waiting outside with Vogue, ask very loudly what was happening. "Your sister," Vogue told him. Wren considered this for a moment. Then, "Does she need food?" "She needs quite a lot of things," Vogue said. "But not from you yet." Her name was Myra Bailey Ironblood. Luke had put Ironblood in her name before Glasha had said a word, and she had held his hand and said nothing because nothing was required. Wren was profoundly interested in Myra and approached her with the specific solemnity of a toddler who has been told to be very careful about something, and is taking the instruction more seriously than adults typically expect. He brought her things: a pine cone, a smooth creek stone, eventually one of the chickens, which required significant logistical intervention on Luke's part. He told her, in the confidential murmur of someone reporting important information, about Ferdinand, and about which chicken was which, and about the best part of the South Bank garden. All of this to an infant who was not processing a word of it and was entirely content with his company regardless. 3 years after Glasha had first walked onto Luke Bailey's land, the Clearwater Valley had a small thing it had not had before, a thing that was not dramatic and did not announce itself, but was there in the fabric of the place. A half-orc child playing in a South Bank garden, a second homestead on the East Road, the words Ironblood Bailey on a trading post stock board, a door on the back wall of a cabin with a small wolf carved into the panel, through which a woman went to her garden every morning and came back in for coffee. Luke sat on the porch one autumn evening when the valley was going to gold and red, and Wren was in the paddock demanding that Marrot run, which Marrot declined to do with the patient good nature of a large horse who has seen many children and is not being moved by enthusiasm. And Glasha was in the garden pulling the last of the autumn carrots, and Myra was in the sling against his chest, asleep with the thoroughness that infants sleep, her small fist curled against the canvas of his shirt. He was looking at all of it: the field, the barn, the door with its carved wolf open to the evening garden, his wife in the garden, his son trying to negotiate with a horse, his daughter sleeping against his heart, and he was thinking about his grandmother in the High Valley, who had said that the most reliable measure of a person was what they did when the work needed doing. Glasha looked up from the carrots and found him looking at her and held his gaze across the autumn yard in the golden light, and there was everything in that look: the frost morning when she had been ready to walk away, and the winter they had shared, and the South Bank garden and the door, and the ring of witnesses in the October yard, and the 2 letters from the north, and the children's names with both their families in them, and the valley which was hard and not perfect and theirs. She said from across the yard, "You are thinking very loudly." "I am thinking how lucky I am," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she stood up from the carrot row, brushing soil from her hands, and she walked across the yard to the porch and went up the step and sat beside him and leaned against his shoulder, and he shifted Myra carefully to accommodate her, and she looked at the valley in the autumn light. "We," she said quietly. "We," he agreed. The fire would be inside in a little while. Wren would give up on Marrot and come crashing onto the porch with the specific energy of a child who has been outdoors all afternoon. Dinner would need making. There were 3 fence rails to check before dark. Ferdinand had an opinion about his evening grain that he would be sharing loudly. But for now there was the porch and the valley and the golden light and the 2 of them, and Myra's small fist against Luke's shirt, and Glasha's shoulder against his arm, and everything built and given and chosen and real. The wolf on the door caught the last of the sun as it turned, a small bright thing carved into solid wood, standing still while the light moved over it, permanent and hers, and proof that a person can stand at the edge of something ready to leave, and find instead that they are exactly where they belong,